Hi, Jonathan York, Bay Financial Partners, looking at markets. Quite an eventful week, really. Obviously, the events in Davos were sort of very interesting, where Trump once again sort of walked back any sort of military operation into Greenland, and obviously the sort of Taco Trump scenario came back to the fore. Now, once again, Trump's sort of speech at Davos was, filled with sort of inaccuracies and sort of falsehoods. Indeed, Trump's claim that the US is the hottest economy in the world, again, is sort of taken a bit of a sort of a body blow with the latest consumer confidence numbers, which are showing a 12-year low. They're expected to come in at a reading of 90, it came in at 84.5. It then sort of followed that up with some really harsh criticism of NATO and especially sort of British forces, where apparently they didn't fight on the sort of front lines in Afghanistan, and that's really upset the British quite intensely. Because once again, evidence totally contradicts Trump's statements. Now that's against the backdrop in the US, which is facing some pretty major issues at present. You've got a huge winter storm coming through, which is really disrupting a lot of the US economy. But also as well, events in Minnesota with yet again a further shooting by ICE agents. And once again, the administration's sort of commentary and sort of comments on it appear to be totally opposite to video evidence that is sort of widely available. And indeed, now it appears that sort of a few of the sort of major CEOs of US major corporations are actually starting to speak up now. Now, it does look like Kevin Walsh is now the sort of favourite to replace Jay Powell at the end of his term as a Fed chair. Now, so far, very quiet on the Supreme Court hearing with Lisa Cook and also the ongoing investigation into Jay Powell. Trump has also floated the idea that potentially income tax in the US will be zero because of all the money that's being taken in from tariffs. Which again, if you just look at the numbers, they don't seem to stack up. Because supposedly the tariffs are going to help reduce the deficit, which is not happening. The deficit is still increasing. Now, the Fed do meet later this month, but expected that rates will be left unchanged. And, really it's going to be very interesting because obviously with that new Fed chair coming in May, if not sooner. But you've still got inflation that is running at around sort of 2.6, 2.7%, which is still well above the Fed's target of 2%. But again, Trump claimed at Davos that core inflation in the US was 1.6%, which is clearly not the case from the data that's being presented. Now, certainly with the potential threat of military action in Greenland receding, US rates have come back just a little bit. The 10-year is 4.23, the 2-year is 3.58, and that 30-year is back to 4.83. But again, on that 10-year, it's still well above that 420 critical level. Now in the full swing of earnings season in the US, and some of the big tech start reporting in the next sort of few days, and it's going to be very interesting to see how those numbers come through. Because so far US earnings have been pretty good. But more importantly as well, guidance has been sort of cautiously optimistic. Now, as stated with that big winter storm in the US, potential for disruption for oil supplies, that's seen oil spike well above sort of $60. Currently 62.20 and change. Now, I sort of mentioned the UK, really pretty insulted by the speech that Trump gave about British soldiers fighting in Afghanistan. And although Trump has now walked back those comments, the damage has been done. Now, with the EU, they've just signed a big sort of mega trade deal with India. That's going to be very interesting to see how Trump views that. Because, according to him, he's the sort of master of the art of the deal. And it looks like India and EU have negotiated a pretty good deal out there. Now in Australia, with the RBA clearly on hold, it's just going to be interesting to see how those inflation numbers do come out. Because if they come out sort of, pretty sort of soft in the next sort of couple of months, potentially there is still room for a further rate cut in Australia. But then on the flip side, if you see that inflation sort of stubbornly sort of sticky, potentially you could be looking at a rate hike in sort of the end of the second quarter. Now here in New Zealand, obviously, really still sort of reeling from events of last week with the big storm that came through. Now here in New Zealand, the election date has been set for November the 7th. But also as well, the latest inflation data was a little bit sort of on the high side, came in at 3.1. Now the Reserve Bank's target is sort of 1 to 3%. So potentially, does that do anything to the Reserve Bank's thinking in terms of interest rates this year? Because really you need to see a clear trend that it is, on an upward trend and well above that sort of 3% target. That was quite interesting as mainstream media sort of jumped on the bandwagon and talking about rate hikes now in New Zealand, which really just seem to be sort of jumping the gun just a little bit. Because you've still got a pretty weak economy. Now, Nicola Willis, the finance minister, is expected to announce the budget date later this week. If you are looking for income options, go to the website www.bayfinancialpartners.co.nz for lots of interesting articles, and we look forward to speaking to you soon.